As well. Well, sir, thank you so much for joining. I guess first of all, let's introduce yourself. I know you and I met. We talked about Darnell, the state mental hospital right here on Harrington Lake, and I was excited to know. And you had worked at Northpoint, and now I'm even more excited. You kind of have the whole story, and I'm really excited to hear about that.
Right. This is the second part to that story. Yes. When the
Oh, that's
prison came in.
awesome. Well, you're gonna have to remind us of some dates. It's now been what, like quite a few months since we did Darnell, but
Right.
well, first of all, let's introduce yourself so everybody can know who you are.
My name is Jack Godbey, and I am the author of the book we're talking about today, which is North Point, the story of a Kentucky prison, which is available on Amazon, by the way.
Excellent. Send me that link when we get done, and I'll be sure it's on our material. Um, yeah, so just in case there's anybody joining who is not familiar, when you are driving, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, I'm just telling myself, when you're driving from Danville into Bergen, you pass a really big parcel of land that backs down into Harrington Lake. And probably
Hmm.
the main thing I see, at least I noticed, was the old Darnell State Hospital building. I don't think there's
Right.
anything else that's high. So as you're driving in, anybody, you will notice Northpoint Correctional Center, and it has got some stories. And I tell you, Jack, anytime I connect with somebody that's one of the old timers, I guess we could call them, back in the 40s and 50s, man, they've got stories about the state hospital, but they've got stories about the prisoners too. So take it away, sir.
Right. Well, I guess just as a quick reminder, where we left off with the Darnell podcast we did, remember that when the hospital closed, we're talking about late 70s, I believe it was 1977, late 70s for sure. So at this point, the hospital is empty. All the buildings are empty, and it's completely unused. This is where the story of North Point begins. Once the state hospital is over and done, and remember it was owned by, uh, or not owned by, but leased by the Army during World War II.
Right.
So one of the things we talked about back then was that when the Army left, when World War II was over with, and before the hospital became operational at the state level, all that Army and military gear was buried there on site.
Wow.
So underneath all the grounds there of the hospital and the current day prison, there you could easily find a complete Jeep, filing cabinets, old weapons, that type of thing. So I know a few years ago there at the prison, they actually found an old hand grenade down on the banks of Harrington Lake
Wow.
that one of the inmates had dug up. And so they called the ATF immediately, and they came and got it and said it was live. If somebody pulled the pin,
Well,
it had
that's
been bad news.
absolutely, that's interesting. Was it a I mean, the Darnell history, like you said, it was built, and before it was a state hospital. It held POWs, and that was the biggest and coolest revelation I remember from the Darnell discussion. Was it ever a depot, like a weapons depot, and that's where that came from? I'm just kind of curious where those weapons would have come from.
No, I've never seen or heard anything about the weapons depot. It was just the weapons they had on ground because they were POW camp. They were expecting, they could possibly be bombed from an air raid,
Right.
at any moment. So they were prepared to defend the facility.
Ah,
Thank goodness they didn't have to, but it was a working hospital. So I feel like one of the things we need to use here to tie the two together from the hospital to the prison is that to remember that when the Army took over, they had the German and the Italian POWs in that hospital. Okay,
yeah.
then they moved them out when the Americans started coming in that needed to have mental treatment. Even though they did share the same building for a while, it was not feasible, obviously, to have the enemies in the war in the same hospital. So they eventually built all these buildings that the Army did. They built all these buildings and spent, I think it was $3.5 million to build these housing units for these German POWs to live in, so the Americans could have the hospital. Now, these buildings we're talking about, they're building is what is now present day North Point. So the hospital is empty and has been empty since the 70s. It is not utilized in any way, shape, or form.
Gotcha.
But these buildings that they built for the German POWs is what is now Northpoint Training Center. So these are buildings that we're talking about.
Okay.
So
I have to
in the
forgive my
late
interruption.
70s,
forgive me, I just have to ask, and I know you must have gone into that building. Like, my past was a therapist, psychiatry, and old asylums are just spooky and freaky to me. Did you ever? I mean, I assume that you went in that building and
Oh yeah,
wow,
many times,
wow.
many, and you can feel the energy in the building of what it was used for. I mean, every hair on my body stood up the first time I went in there.
Yep.
The energy in that building was just
Sorry
remarkable.
for
That's why I
interrupting.
fell in love with it.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. I just had to ask.
That's all right.
All right. So yeah.
So if we're starting the story of the prison, so remember that everything was vacated in the late 70s. Of course, they had the uh, boys juvenile facility there in the early 80s. It was only there for a very short time, maybe 2 or 3 years. The funding ran out for that. They had all these teenage boys there at the prison, and then the state really kind of changed their game plan, and they didn't want teenagers to be in an institution. So they kind of redone that policy, and they kind of wanted them to be in more of a house situation. They wanted, no more than 10 of these juveniles at one time. So long story short, Kentucky changed their plan. They didn't want them in an institution, so they closed this place. So now we're talking 1982, 83, and the place was completely empty. So the city of Danville, now this is where the story begins. The city of Danville, the commissioners here got their eye on this place. Okay, this would be a great, great country club. It's right on the banks of Lake Harrington, just a few miles from downtown Danville. All this land, it would be ideal. So they had their heart set on this. The problem was that the land belonged to the state, and
Yeah.
the state wasn't doing anything with it. But they were willing, to talk to Danville about it and say, listen, we might work something out. Okay. The other part of the story, while all this was happening, 1982, the two existing prisons in Kentucky at that time was the Kentucky State Penitentiary and the Kentucky State Reformatory in LaGrange and far western Kentucky. So the two prisons that we had. So these prisons were severely overcrowded, okay, to the point where it was basically inhumane. So all the prisoners of these two prisons got together and they filed a federal lawsuit. Said the violation of our Eighth Amendment rights, cruel and unusual punishment, because everything was so crowded, and they sued the Kentucky Department of Corrections in the federal court based on overcrowding, based on the fact they had no legal library, they had no way to fight their case, no way. Once they were in prison, they were just there, no access to attorneys. And ironically enough, they even sued because they wanted the Department of Corrections staff, the officers, to have more training. At that time, there was no training involved with the DOC staff, so they tended to gravitate toward, I guess, a rougher crowd. And they wanted more. They wanted better treatment. They wanted the officers, or they call them the guards. I hate that word. I don't use that word guards. It's kind of an insult, but
That would
officers.
sorry to interrupt. You worked at Northpoint, correct?
Yeah, 20 years. Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to. I sorry, I can't remember if you mentioned that but I remember we had talked about that, and that was your special
We had,
insight into
yeah.
that.
Yeah. So that was part of the lawsuit. So when the lawsuit went through, the judge actually agreed with these inmates and said, "You're correct." And they gave Kentucky a order. You got a very short time to get this together, or you're going to be in some deep trouble.
Wow.
So that they had to find a way for these inmates that were overcrowded, had somewhere for them to go. You can't just invent somewhere for them to go. You got to have some building for them to go to. Well, here's at the time, Governor Martha Lane Collins was a governor at that time. But she had to make a decision. We've got to comply with this federal order very quickly. So they're set North Point completely empty. So to anybody with any sense, that's a no-brainer. I got to find a place for inmates to go, and I got an empty building that we already own. It's a no-brainer. So the state told Danville, "Sorry, you're out of luck. No country club for you. We got to use this as a prison." And
Shocker.
of course, yeah. So the city commissioners was really I guess you could say they became irate at that. They don't want a prison in Danville. Everybody that lives in Danville knows Danville is very cultural. We're all about Center College, brass band, all these things that are cultural. There is no room for a prison here. We're sorry. So they were against it from day one.
That's
So
interesting,
the
Jack.
DLC,
I never thought of that. Honestly, I never. I mean, it's been there the whole time, obviously, that I've been a part of this community, and so I never really thought of it from that perspective. That's really, and those were that was
yeah,
the 80s, 82, 83, 84.
this was about 82. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So they started moving. They started moving forward with the prison, and of course Danville just fought them the entire way. We do not want this prison here, and their big thing was it's going to bring down property values. It's going to put our citizens at risk. Somebody escapes. That's all they kept preaching is, what if we have an escape? What if we have a right? And the DOC was trying to tell them, everything's fine. So they told them this: it's going to be a temporary solution to a long-term problem. North Point is not permanent. It is very temporary, just to get us out of this lawsuit. Then we'll find something else to do.
Hmm.
So we're going to have less than 500 inmates here. They're all going to be low key, low violence. Even if one of them did escape, there's no risk to the community. There's no big deal here. There's no fences. None of that's happening. So just calm down. Everything's fine. So Danville agreed to this. Okay, we're okay with this. We can live with this a little bit. So then, as when the lawsuit came down and they had to find places for people to go, all that plan got scrapped. Now we have some of the worst inmates in Kentucky coming to North Point,
Wow.
and it went from 500 to 1,200. It went from minimum custody to medium maximum custody with full blown fences and razor wire, and all of a sudden, Danville has found itself with a full blown prison.
Wow.
It's just happened. So
Yeah.
again, Danville was all right.
What was the turnaround on that? Not very long, between 500 to
Very
1200.
shortly. Yeah, very shortly time. Yeah.
Wow.
So everything changed when this federal lawsuit came down, because now we've got to comply with this. So all those other plans were scrapped. So now they got a full blown prison coming. So the problem came in because Danville was still very much all right. We do not want you here. They made that pretty clear. We don't want you here. Um, so they kind of met. We want to be a good neighbor. The state says we want to be a good neighbor to you. We want to kind of fit in. So let's meet. Let's talk about this. So they talked about it. So again, they told them temporary solution, long-term problem. It's not permanent. And so they also told the city of Danville, you can name this place. That way you don't have penitentiary, reformatory, that kind of thing tagged to your town. You name it. So the city commission named it Northpoint Training Center. It's at the northernmost corner of the county. And if you hear training center, what do you think? It's a school. It's some kind
Right.
of vocational school, which is exactly what I thought the entire time I was growing up. I had no idea what that place was.
I thought it was
It's
a
some mystery building.
I thought it was like a tech community center.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the purpose behind naming it that.
Well, they did a good
If you were
job.
to drive by, yeah, if you if you drive by there, you have no. It's just some kind of mystery building sitting off Highway 33. You have no idea what it is,
Yeah.
and that was the purpose. So the other part of this is that they made a deal that even though this prison is just a few miles from downtown Danville, it has a Bergen address. They didn't want nothing to do with the town of Danville. So the actual address that you send mail to is Bergen, even though the prison is in Danville.
I did
So
not
now
realize.
all this mail, yeah. So all this mail that comes through, all this prisoners writing letters in and out, and all these packages are all held in little tiny Bergen post office. Keeps those guys hopping, I'm sure,
That's
instead of
hilarious.
the bigger, yeah. But it was all done because Danville didn't want associated with the prison at all. That was part of the deal. So they keep saying it's going to be all right. We don't want an escape. They're just scared to death. And again, they're telling them, this is moving forward with you or without you. It's happening, but we want to be a good neighbor. We want to try to make everything happen. Just calm down. It's temporary. So the prison opens up 1983, and the relations between Danville and North Point are still very tense because they're not wanted. They feel like they're not wanted. Um, Most towns want a prison to come because it means jobs. Danville's not one of those towns. They were all about the culture of it and having a nice little town, which is understandable. But when this happened, 1983, the prison opened up and they hired their staff. A bunch of the first staff they hired, by the way, was some of the people who were lost their job at the mental hospital a few years earlier. So those guys got first shot at coming in and being a correctional officer. So the prison started, and the whole time, Danville and Northpoint were at odds. And they kept preaching, right, escape, right, escape. But wouldn't you know it, less than a year in operation, Northpoint has their first escape. So the worst thing that could possibly happen happens. So we're telling Danville the whole time, it's fine, it's fine. It's not fine. We had an escape. So what happened was they were still building. They had to comply with this federal order really quickly, so they didn't have all the security fences up when the inmates came. They were locked in. They were locked inside the living unit. They couldn't get out, but they were still connecting the security fences with the razor wire. And there on the property, there's 4 towers. They call them the gun tower. Every tower is placed around the yard with an officer, armed officer, in the top of it for escapes. And if they try to escape and go over the fence, then they're shot. Well, the fences connect from one tower to second tower to the third tower to the fourth tower till you make a complete circle. Well, the fence was not connected at the last tower. They ran out of time. It was dark, foggy, and the company said, we'll finish it up in the morning. Well, unbeknownst to them, there was an inmate there looking out the window that was watching everything going on. And he saw the fence was down. His mind started turning. The gears started clicking. Okay, so third shift comes in. He asked the third shift officer, hey, officer, I'm going to take this trash out for you. I'd be happy to do that. The officer says, yeah, sure. I'll stand here and watch it. You take it on out. When he took the trash out, he was in the wind. He knew, even though it was real foggy, you couldn't see the hand in front of your face. He knew exactly where that fence was down. And he ran straight for it. And he was in the wind. So just like that, Northpoint had their first escape. Now there was a second inmate who also tried to escape, pushed the officer down and ran out the door. But he didn't know where the fence was down. So he was kind of running around in circles in the fog. Didn't have any idea how to get out. He didn't go anywhere.
But
He ended up in the razor wire.
That was the same night.
Same night, yeah. So one inmate was let out purposely to take the trash out. The second inmate kind of forced his way out, but he wasn't watching like the first guy was. So he ate up with the razor wire and he gave up. So I'm done. But the other guy was gone, but he didn't get far. They actually found him within, I think it was 2 hours, and he was on Faulkner Station Road on the railroad tracks. Lost, didn't know where to go, didn't know where he was at, didn't know which direction was which. He just didn't plan that far ahead. So he was captured immediately. So just like that, now we got to explain to Danville, okay, we told you it wasn't going to be an escape, but guess what? There was an escape. So this kind of makes the tension.
I feel like as humans, we're really good with that. Everything's fine. It's totally going to be fine until it gets proved otherwise.
Right. That's exactly what happened. So we try to convince Danville, everything's fine. The escape happened. It's over. Nobody was hurt. So they went on with business. So only a few short months later, at the beginning of 1984 now, so the prison's been in operation now for a little over a year, and they experienced their first riot.
Wow.
So everything that they were accused of happened. So, and this riot happened just kind of out of the blue. It wasn't an issue with, mistreatment or anything of that nature like most riots are. It just kind of happened. Two inmates got in a fight, and this guy joined in, this guy put his joined in. Before you know it, the entire place was fighting each other. And the prison was completely in riot mode. So there was 10 people injured in that riot, a mixture of officers and inmates. But it was stopped pretty quickly. So you would think that because we had an escape and a riot within the first year, just like Danville said they were afraid it was going to happen, you would think that would happen, that Danville would be saying, I told you so. But strangely enough, it seemed like it calmed the city of Danville down a little bit, because the worst thing could happen, the riot happened, an escape happened, and you guys handled it. There was no problem. Nobody was hurt. You guys are on top of your game. So it's actually, it seemed like it helped the relationship a little bit.
Yeah. I think that's a brilliant response. I mean, you guys very quickly had to deal with the two things that they were the most afraid of, and you bounced them out, like, really good. I mean, that's really great. That's interesting that was the turn of events in Danville.
Yeah, that was a turn of events. So from that point forward, things changed drastically between the two, and then the relationship started to improve. Actually, of course, now present day, the relationship between the two is awesome. They work together. They've even The state even donated some land out there for a brand new fire station to be built for the county, which is there on ground in Northpoint now. They work very closely with the city commissioners. They work with a leadership program that is there in Danville. They come out and they tour the place every year, and some of the commissioners come out for lunch every year. It's just a really good relationship. Now we work together, which is the way prisons should be. Prisons have a habit of being isolated.
Yeah.
They kind of cut off from the world, and essentially the last couple of wardens that they had there really made it their life's mission is we don't want to be solo here. We want to be part of the community, just like the hospital is part of the community.
Right.
It's huge. Then all of a sudden, here comes Northpoint, and all of a sudden, everything's cut off. Not even allowed to.
I'm assuming just because I know that there are a lot of prisons that are operated privately now for prison for profit, I guess you hear. And
Right.
This just to verify that this is again, it's state. This is state funded.
Right.
That's cool. That's cool. And also just another, I'm kind of curious, does Danville get any type of federal kickback for, I mean, is there a financial benefit for Danville now? Do you think? I mean, do you think that was perhaps a little bit of the change of mind?
Not that I've ever heard or seen anything about that. I just feel like the relationship really started to improve because the prison started opening up a little bit.
Well, I think and I think that that's great. I didn't mean anything negative by it at all. I just curious because it makes sense sometimes if they're going to get a little bit more funding, let's say, then they're more apt to do things. But them doing these things without that motivation is that type of financial motivation. That's pretty great. That's really great.
So like in present day, like inmate has or Northpoint has a unit there that's minimum custody that's not behind the fence. That we call their outside details. Those guys, if you're on Harrington Lake and you're driving by the prison property, these are the guys you're going to see on the creek bank fishing or whatever. Because they're allowed to do that. They're not violent. They work every day. This is a whole different subset of what's inside the fence. Inside the fence is dangerous. But the story goes on. This is that after this riot happened, there was kind of a big because the one thing that, or temporary, one thing they found out when the riot happened is they didn't have any kind of segregation unit at all to deal with these people who are rioting. Because the idea is in prison, if somebody's causing a problem, you put them in segregation, you put them away from the rest of the people till they calm down, and you can rejoin the general population. You don't want somebody who's angry and fighting and violent in with everybody else. So the idea of segregation is to isolate them till things are different. Well, if Northpoint didn't have no such building, they were completely unprepared for this. So they built a segregation unit. I think 1984, right after the riot, they built a segregation unit with 60 cells in there, individual cells where guys could be by themselves. So one of the things that the community then started hollering about is, if Northpoint's so temporary, why are you building buildings? Why are you adding on here? So this started a whole big deal in Frankfort. A couple of the legislators got involved, and they were kind of joining with Danville and saying, you shouldn't be building buildings. You shouldn't be acting like it's a permanent situation. It's temporary. And they tried everything in their power to close down the prison. At the end of the day, the representative finally came to the city of Danville and said, fact of life is Northpoint is not temporary. It is permanent. It is a permanent solution. Which is not what they wanted to hear. But by that time, the tension started to ease a lot anyway. So it was not that big of a deal. But it went all through the fight with Frankfort, went all through the legislature, went through all the representatives in Frankfort, and everybody tried to fighting for it, fighting against it. And eventually, as bad as we hate to have prisons, the fact is they are a fact of life. You can say that it's not in my backyard, but it's got to be in somebody's backyard. The consequences are too great. So Northpoint was up, it was operational, it was running, and it didn't make a lot of sense to do anything different with it. So it became permanent. And of course, it's been there for all these years and been a good part of the community, and beneficial. Besides the Ephraim McDowell, my knowledge, I think it's the largest employer in Boyle County, or 300 plus staff out there, you know.
Hey, Jack, I'm so sorry. You cut out there for about 30 seconds. That one point you just made. Would you mind repeating it for us?
Sure. The North Point is also beneficial because it is a large employer. It says, to
Yeah,
my knowledge, they are the second behind Ephraim McDowell Hospital as far as in Boyle County.
I didn't
There's
realize.
over 300
Yeah,
staff that work there, not just correctional officers. We're talking about, administrative staff and programming staff and school teachers and people
sure.
that vocational teachers, and there's vocational teachers teaching electricity and brick masonry, and teachers doing GED. All these people, it's like a full-blown society that's separate from regular society that's going on there right underneath our noses, and we
Yeah,
don't ever really hear anything about it.
absolutely. Um, I think that that's amazing. I was gonna ask you. Oh no, I was just thinking you were talking about employment when we did the Darnell podcast, and I had posted that there were so many people in our Harrington Lake history group that chimed in, said, mom and dad used to work there, aunt and uncle used to work there, and the same as it was transitioned to North Point. So there's a lot of local touch points for that facility this past
Yes.
century.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the things I really found interesting about when I was doing research in the book about the Darnell, was just that there was so many contacts. Everybody you talked to had some kind of contact. They either worked there, their parents worked there, had an uncle who was a patient there. Somebody was connected with it. Everybody I talked to had some kind of connection. Nobody told me, well, I don't know anything about it.
Right.
Everybody had something and wanted to know more. That's why I wrote the book to begin with. So the Northpoint book was separate, was originally going to be together with the Darnell book, but the two stories were so interesting, I decided to write two separate books,
Absolutely.
because
Well, like, yeah,
they
I
each
mean,
have their own story, you know.
yeah, they both sound, I mean, from what I'm now learning from you now, I mean, those are two completely unique situations.
Yes,
And even the North Point of the 80s and 90s is incredibly different than the North Point of this century, I mean, it's going on 40
absolutely.
years, you know what I mean? And I know that like the Reagan years, there was a fairly substantial ramp up in sentencing minimum. I mean, there was what they called the mandatory minimums and,
Mhm.
all of these things. So I definitely understand how you guys went from 500 to 1200 practically overnight.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
yeah,
just in my 20-year career, I've seen as different governors, different presidents start going. At one moment, somebody wants to lock everybody up, so you start getting really, really crowded, and then this guy comes in and wants to let everybody go, so everybody's getting released. So it's all just a matter of the political climate. But the prisons are there every day doing the job that, for example, you may have a guy who is really, really violent. The cops may deal with him for a few hours. The courts deal with him for a few minutes. Corrections deal with him every single day for years.
right.
So it's a hard job. So those guys out there doing that job are the guys I have respect for, because nobody sees it.
Mhm.
Nobody has any idea what they're doing, but they're doing it, and they get to sleep in bed at night at safe because they're doing it. And that's what I
Absolutely.
always respect of
Yeah,
those guys.
absolutely. That is not a
I'm
job.
home in bed
No, I was just
yeah,
saying,
I'm enjoying myself at home.
I worked in a juvenile, I worked in a JV facility myself doing casework and therapy. And yeah, that is a very different life. I mean, those people, yeah, I mean, that was one of those things I felt uncomfortable just almost the whole time. It was just a very different environment to work within in comparison to a hospital or, a clinic.
Yes.
But that said, I always did have the utmost respect for those individuals that are trying to do that every day. I do have
Yeah.
to steer you into any good. I mean, this has been such a great story, Jack. But I know all of our listeners and watchers want to hear some interesting things about Harrington Lake. You have any good Harrington Lake stories?
Well, having a prison on Harrington Lake is interesting and challenging at times.
Yeah.
Obviously, the minimum security inmates there can utilize the lake. They can go fishing. Um, Unfortunately, they find a way to mess it up. As boats go by, um, somebody will flash them from a boat, and then the inmates gets all tore up and starts jumping in the water. Once they do that, it's over with. The warden's like, okay, now you can't have access to it anymore. That type of thing. but to me, it's a huge privilege for those guys to be able to go down there and fish. And of
Sure.
course, they had at one time there, they had a shrimp pond there at Northpoint where they raised their own shrimp and sold it to the public. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
I'd say probably yeah, they sure did. Probably the wildest story that I heard that with the lake involved was, of course, the lake goes right up to prison property. You can be walking the yard there, and you can hear people on the boats on the lake hooting and hollering, having a great time, having no idea just a few feet away, is one of the most violent cultures you're ever going to experience.
Wow.
They're completely in oblivion because they're having a great time. But probably one of the craziest stories I heard was one of those boats that was close to there. He parked his boat there and walked up on the ground, which is prison property. He didn't know that, and this guy was pretty intoxicated. Matter of fact, he was a lot intoxicated, and he walked all up in prison grounds. And of course, he was swarmed almost immediately.
Wow.
The sad part about it is he also had a weapon. He had a gun tucked down inside of his waistband. So he happened to be he was stopped immediately, and of course that could have been a very bad situation, because the officer had the right, to shoot him if he pulled
Right.
that weapon out.
Yeah.
And then you're shooting a citizen. So imagine what that would have been in the headlines.
Sure.
Thankfully,
Anybody's, even if it was private residential property, same thing. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
don't go walking on the property. Jack, I can't remember. For the life of me, I can't remember if there's any signage around the lake perimeter around that section. Is there any signage to indicate that's North Point?
To my understanding, there is now.
Oh,
At that time of this happened, there was not.
sure, and that makes sense. I just cannot remember. I think I'm too busy looking at other things, and I forget. And I guess that's probably a good point. I forget about North Point being there. You know what I mean? What else was I going to ask about?
Yeah.
Oh, any advice? I mean, so you say, like if there's anybody in a boat passing by that's kind of messing with people, do you have any advice for any of our boaters and people other than just, stay away?
Well, the only again, these people that you're going to come in contact with are very low risk criminals, so they're not, quote unquote dangerous.
That's good.
But if you see inmates on the coast, fishing or doing anything else, the number one advice I would give them is just keep going. Don't have any interaction. Don't talk to them. Don't interact with them in any way, shape, or form. Because while it may be totally fine for you, if the inmate is caught interacting with somebody like that, he's in trouble. So they're actually harming him by speaking to him.
That makes
So
sense.
the best thing to do is just wave and keep going.
Thank you for clarifying. That's really great. And also that the previous story about getting on landing and getting onto that property, if that happened at night, man, that would be
It'd be rough. Yeah.
And so they absolutely do have permission to shoot.
Yes, if somebody comes on the ground with a weapon, that would be bad news. Yes.
Yeah, and understandable. And I certainly know enough fishermen that pack, you know what I mean? So that's great info. At the very least, of all things, that is really good information to know. Jack, these have been some great stories, man. I've been kind to see if there were any comments, but just had a few people. I was doing a Facebook Live just to give it a test.
Yeah.
Would you mind if anybody has any other questions, I may send you an email with some follow-up questions.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, and we would love to get the link to your book, and I'll get that out there as well. Both of them, please, Darnell as well as Northpoint. I know that you have left out some good stuff, and you got to get people to read the book.
Well, one thing I'll add in there is in the book about Northpoint, there are tons of pictures of the Northpoint being built, Northpoint back in the old days during the riot when that thing was going on. So there's good, interesting pictures in there that you'll enjoy.
Jack, if there's any chance, I'm going to go back and sort of repatch this video a little bit or audio, and I was thinking about putting in some photos. If there are any that you could send, that would be awesome, and I'll try to integrate that into this recording.
Sure.
Well, man, this has been awesome. I can't thank you enough. This has been incredibly educational. Really appreciate it. Send me that info so I can get those books out there for people, and I'm going to share this with the main Harrington Lake community, but also the history community. So keep your eyes out. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people interested. I'll have it up on YouTube next week.
Very good.
Awesome. Thank you so much, sir. And if there's another topic you ever want to talk about that has some sort of Harrington Lake thing, we'll love to hear about it.
We got you.
Have a great day.
Thank you.